Welcome to BB 101 course at IIT Bombay. Professor Srivastava is going to deliver his lecture in Molecular and Cellular Biology module shortly. Please mute your microphone and be ready with pen and notepad to take notes. Thank you. Welcome to BB 101 course at IIT Bombay. Please mute your microphone and be ready with pen and notepad to take notes. Thank you.
All right, very good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have already watched the lecture 1 video. Essentially, I talked about introduction to this course, and also I gave you tour of a cell biology, especially tour of the cell with different organelle and its features. So this is going to be a more interactive session where we are going to take some of your queries and also give you some other important concepts. Just to get started, so that everybody is already on the same page, I've already discussed that in my video earlier, but this course has 3 modules. The first module is molecular and cell biology, which I have started, and Professor Rahul Purwar will be after me. And then we have 2 other modules, physical biology and biomedical engineering, which will be taught by Professor Ambrish Kumar and Sanita Kanekar. So till the mid-sem, you have to study the first module, which will be MCB. And each instructor will have their own quizzes. And the mid-sem will have essentially 40 marks from the MCB module. Post mid-sem, the physical biology, biomedical engineering, that part will be covered in the end sem. So you don't have to again revise the MCB module. That will be only covered till mid-sem. So as we, you can see the distribution of the marks here, that how module-wise the weightage for different modules we have, and distribution of the marks for different mid-sem, end-sem, and the quizzes. Minimum 30% will be the passing marks. But overall in this course, the students have really done quite well. And large number of students, we see that, performing over 90% or so, and many of them also get even AP or AA. So if you are really, cautious to start with, and you are keeping up the pace with interest and excitement, I think this can be also a high scoring course in addition to learning something very new. The my MCB module part, I'm going to essentially start with the cell biology part, where I already delivered my lecture on the tour of a cell. And my next lecture, I'll talk about the cell cycle. After that, I'll talk about introduction to metabolism, then genome and DNA tools. And the last 2 lectures will be based on the Mendelian genetics and chromosomal and molecular basis of inheritance. All the lectures are uploaded in the YouTube, which you already have the link. We're also going to play the quizzes, which will be on kahoot.it. And I am available on this email ID. Please feel free to write any specific query, which I'm not able to respond back on the forum or any other places gets missed out. Do write back to me with your specific query. This course has, of course, a lot of contents, and to keep it simple, we try to follow one textbook, which is the prescribed textbook of this course, which is Campbell Biology, 10th edition of that. So the book is probably available to your CRs, and you can try to contact them to get the copy. The course contents are uploaded in the YouTube, which you might have seen the first video. Some of you might have missed out that the description of the video, if you click on that, I have already provided the handout as well in the description of the video, which means the PDF of the PPT, which I speak in the video. Those are already provided to you. And also we have given a Q&A session form, so that if you, while watching the video, if you find something is unclear or any specific slide has any problem, you can write your query based on the slide number, so that that can be taken in this live session and can be clarified to you. I hope the modalities are going to be straightforward, and probably it is now clear to you. Each lecture and tutorial is going to be uploaded in the YouTube. Along with that, the handouts and some other study material or Q&A will all be in the description of the video, so that everything is in one place. All right. So while primarily I'm going to take this session for having Q&A and more discussion, but I'll give you at least a couple of interesting points to before we jump into the Q&A session. I'll first introduce you to one of the clinician, Dr. Jayanti Shastri. She is head of the microbiology department at Kasturba Hospital and Nair Hospital, and she works actively on the infectious diseases. During this COVID-19 pandemic time, she was very active clinician who was involved in various type of serological testing in Mumbai. And you might have heard of her interview or name in different contexts of COVID-19. So we had opportunity to work with her on different projects. Even the COVID-19 clinical project, we also worked with her group. I had invited her at IIT Bombay earlier to interact with BB 101 students. Especially, I want to give all of you the views and vision that how clinicians could actually benefit from these interactions and novel devices or indigenous devices, or new ways of thinking about how to overcome the patient-related challenges. So in this slide, in today, I'm going to introduce you Dr. Jayanti Shastri, who's going to give you a brief overview about her perspective on infectious diseases and how to take this field forward. So let me show this video clip to you.
It's actually my very, very proud privilege to be talking to such bright students of the Indian Institute of Technology. I cannot thank Dr. Sanjeeva enough for giving me this opportunity. So what I really wanted to talk to you is about the challenges and opportunities we have in infectious disease diagnosis, and just to walk you through what we currently do in terms of infectious disease diagnosis and what is a possibility. So I think I'm okay. So this is the lab I head. We do molecular diagnosis for commonly the acute febrile illnesses, which is dengue, malaria, typhoid, hepatitis, and we also are the regional HIV reference lab. So we do what is called as early infant diagnosis for testing HIV in the newborn babies at 6 weeks, and also do the HIV viral loads. So we are part of the national program. So anybody who's interested in seeing molecular diagnostics by real-time PCRs for these infectious diseases, you're welcome. So as we can see, microbes. So when we say infectious agents of disease, there are a number of infectious agents of disease. Infectious diseases, as we all know, is the scourge of mankind. There have been older diseases like plague, like whooping cough, like diphtheria, and we have been able to completely eliminate these diseases by vaccination. And what is now we are faced with are emerging infectious diseases, and that would be the last leg of my talk. So when we talk of bacteria, they could be both gram-positive and gram-negative. Why is it important? Because the antibiotics which we use for gram-positive organisms are different from those which we use for gram-negatives. That is because of their inherent cell wall nature. The gram-positive organisms have more of peptidoglycan, and the gram-negatives have got more of lipids. And we can see that bacteria, viruses, the dengue is a virus, hepatitis is a virus. Then parasites, we have malarial parasite, trypanosomiasis, then we have all the worm infestations, these are all parasites. Fungi could be candida, cryptococcus, histoplasmosis, other fungi which infect human beings. When it comes to a clinical sample which we receive in the laboratory for testing for infectious disease agents, we get all these kind of samples, the blood samples, stool samples, urine, nasopharyngeal aspirates, pus aspirates. We don't know whether this clinical sample has got bacteria, viruses, fungus or a parasite. So we have to put it through a battery of tests in order to individually identify these pathogens. The other alternative is do molecular diagnosis by multiplex PCR. And what is multiplex PCR? We have targets for bacteria, viruses, parasites all put together. We are up to an extent of 20 pathogens in the respiratory sample, and we look for the presence of any of these agents. Why is it important for us to know? Because with bacteria, what we can do is the antimicrobial susceptibility testing, which is done by the conventional method in the laboratory using Muller-Hinton agar, and we streak the plate with the microorganism, look for the zones of inhibition. But what we are seeing is drug resistance is on the rise. So we need to know whether the clinical sample has got drug resistant bugs or it has drug sensitive bugs. Whether artemisinin, which is given as a drug of choice for malaria, is the parasite resistant or is it sensitive to that drug? So these are certain questions which always bog our minds when we are treating patients and when we are giving a promise. So what are infectious diseases which are emerging? These are evolutionary changes in the existing organisms, spread of known diseases into new geographic areas, ecological changes resulting in introduction of unusual agents and drug resistance. The World Health Organization has warned in its 2007 report that infectious diseases are emerging at a rate that has not been seen before. Since 1970s, there have been 40 infectious diseases which have been discovered, and these are some of them. Just a little bit of information about SARS. So SARS is a respiratory syndrome, the subacute respiratory syndrome, which it cropped up in the Guangdong province of China. And how near we are to China, but it never came to India. It knocked the doors very loudly on our territories, but somehow we never got infected. We don't know the reason. We presume that we have been infected with so many respiratory viruses which have caused cross immunity. So these are certain suppositions. Ebola virus. Now we know that Sierra Leone and other places were in the grip of the Ebola virus infection. However, fortunately for the Indians, it never seeped into India. Otherwise, I don't know how many communities would have been wiped off, because it is a highly transmissible virus, very easily transferred from one individual to another. So chikungunya, we are in the grip of it, even in Delhi, in Mumbai. Swine flu, we had two major epidemics in 2009-10 as well as in 2015. Avian flu now has been declared in some parts of Maharashtra. So these are certain emerging infectious diseases. So these are significantly correlated with socio-economic, environmental and ecological factors. So this is the last part of my presentation, is something which I thought was important to you people and for us, and that's where we could bridge the gap of artificial intelligence. Would it help to crack biology? And as I understand, there are lots of companies who are working on this project, the Alphabet, IBM, Microsoft, all the big companies in the Silicon Valley. So Chris Bishop of Microsoft Research in Cambridge observes one way of thinking about living organisms is to recognize that they are, in a sense, complex systems which process information using a combination of hardware and software. So in the squidgy words of biology and disease, there are problems its software engineers can solve, and the solution lies with all of you. So What are the challenges? Today I don't know which is the infection which is going to tap my door and enter my territory. Do I have any information about the hotspots in my own country of certain infectious diseases? Well, in the West they are using GIS mapping for hotspots. So, can we use artificial intelligence for forecasting infectious diseases? And I also read that diagnosing illness by smell is also going to be a very near possibility. And I am sure it is the Harvard Medical School, MIT engineers and the Baylor School of Medicine and Rice University, all of them, you know, they have these collaborative projects for all these solutions. And I think that's the way forward. Currently, we have no preparedness. We really keep banking on good luck and host immunity for not getting these infectious diseases. Well, I have also read about drug discovery. New molecules are discovered through artificial intelligence, and this is one actor in that theater of biology and artificial intelligence, and 2 neuroscience drugs in the pipeline the molecules have been discovered by artificial intelligence. Now these are, this was an article in JAMA where you can detect diabetic retinopathy and macular edema, 2 causes of blindness through artificial intelligence. There are lots of companies which are you know, coming up with artificial intelligence through apps to diagnose the patient's queries about symptoms and diagnose the conditions. IBM is able to suggest treatment plans for a number of different cancers, and all this has a potential to transform doctors' abilities to screen for and diagnose disease. Where is it important? It is extremely important where the doctor-patient ratio is skewed. If you go to London, the NHS will give you an appointment after 2 months. If you go with a lump in breast and go for an appointment after 2 months, I think you will die of anxiety. So in such conditions, these apps are of very great use, where they give you some direction about what probably the condition could be and where the waiting period. See, India is the best place for healthcare. I can just pay, walk into any doctor's clinic and get myself examined. It is not the same. In the United States, you are completely bound by your insurance policy as to where you go. If your insurance policy expects you to go to one particular doctor, switching doctors is really going to make holes in your pocket. So these apps are going to be of great use in such places to give some tentative diagnosis. But of course, it comes with a word of caution. Most known protein structures have been worked out from crystallized versions, whereas in reality proteins are flexible. More work needs to be done at the molecular level, and quoting Sir Isaac Newton, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulder of giants. And if the brains of those giants happen to be made of silicon chips, so be it. So to end my talk, I would say please stay focused, work consistently on a problem, maintain quality at all costs, and come up with a low cost technology. Ours is a developing country. We cannot use very expensive diagnostics for patient care. If solutions have to be offered at bedside, they have to be affordable. So thank you all for your attention, and when you feel like giving up, look back at how far you have come. Be strong, stay on your path, and never stop going. Thank you very much.
My lab is primarily focusing on proteomics-based applications to investigate different types of clinical problems. As you can hear a lot of noise here, I am trying to show you some of the technology which we use in our lab for doing the clinical proteomics research. Instrument what we are standing nearby is one of the next generation sequences, and I will explain you shortly that when this SARS-CoV-2 virus started showing its impact and COVID-19 was supposed to become a pandemic, we first needed to know about the sequence of this virus, and that's where the next generation sequencer and these kind of technologies are very helpful to to decode the genome and tell us that what is the genomic composition of a given organism which can be utilized to further detect that type of organism. So, ELISpot can be detect these viral peptides and whatever responses are happening because of the virus to the human, to the host response, using mass spectrometry technology. So first of all, we try to look for what all proteins are present in the virus using these mass spectrometers. And then the goal was to look at also the host proteins which are getting modulated in response to this virus. So this instrument is known as LC-MS. The first part is the electrochromatography or the nanoanalysis, and then we have electrospray ionization, and then we have the tri-plate mass spectrometer, which is one of the orbitrap technologies coupled with quadrupole and ion trap. So here the goal is to have this very high resolution mass spectrometer. Can we try to separate the complex protein mixture, and that comes under deep proteome investigation. So we first looked at variety of samples from the patients, from the nasopharyngeal swab, which is currently being used for the RT-PCR detection, as well as the plasma sample, which gives the good pathophysiological information from the patient. And these samples were deep profiled in shotgun proteomics using the LC-MS application. So after the deep proteome profiling is done, the next goal is can we develop some of the simple assays or tests using mass spectrometer, which can be utilized for two activities. One for looking at the SARS-CoV-2 viral peptides, that is in some way an alternative to the viral peptide detection. Or second, it could be can we look into the host response and the protein, which could be prognostic biomarkers for disease severity progression. So this instrument is a triple quadrupole mass spectrometer, which can be utilized to specifically look at the peptides which are showing maximum change in response to given disease. Or for that matter, if we are looking at the detection of the virus, we are only looking at the specific viral peptides and totally ignoring all the host protein types. So this technology works in the field of proteomics, known as targeted proteomics, where we develop this kind of assays using selected reaction monitoring, and our goal over there is to look at the respective transitions of these peptides, which can be then monitored further to detect if there is a virus present or not. Or if we are looking at the host response, then we want to know whether a specific peptide from the host side is showing any alteration or the change in abundance in response to disease severity progression. So given that whenever a viral induces the host immune response, they will metabolize also get altered. And we thought can we investigate the plasma samples of COVID-19 infected patients and try to investigate which of the metabolites which are getting altered in response to COVID-19. And again we use another type of mass spectrometer. This is one of the orbitrap used with the mass spectrometer. And along with that we have the UHPLC. So here you can have much larger volume of the sample to be injected, and that sample we are looking for with very simple organic solvents like methanol extractions. We want to look at which of the metabolites which are coming from the patient, and these kinds of peaks just simply depicts that can we start looking at the regions where the metabolites are maximally getting changed, and that of course requires a lot of computation analysis to find out which of the metabolites which are getting changed. Okay, so let me now take you to our actual molecular biology lab, and of course I have to wear the mask now because of the COVID situation. So we will just give you a brief, virtual tour of the lab where people do sample preparation and all kind of molecular biology based work. Of course, you are going to look at a variety of fancy instruments, but something as simple as this thermal cycler, that itself also is very crucial. And at the time of pandemic, that really served its purpose for looking at how viral amplification can be detected from the mRNA using the real-time PCR. So again, some of the basic technology which we talk in the course are routinely used in the molecular biology labs, and that have really helped during this pandemic time. I'll take you to another instrument which is quite helpful, and let me now show you another technology which is microarrays, and we are talking about protein microarrays here. So these are high density array which is having thousands of protein printed on this small microscopic glass slide, and this actually contains almost 40,000 features consisting of 18,000 plus proteins. So now think about on these kind of high density chips with very small volume of patient samples, you can screen different type of biomarkers looking for autoantibodies or various type of protein interactors, right? So that's where I think you can think about with modern technologies how looking at interaction and interactomics have become quite feasible. So on the screen what I'm showing you here is one of the slides showing the protein expression with the GST tag, and that shows that we have to do a lot of placing the grid etc. to make sure that we can find out the right intensities of these proteins, and then that could be utilized for subsequent big data analysis. This is a small scanner which is quite helpful for scanning these chips and different wavelengths. So using one of the instruments which is not so commonly used in proteomics, but especially for the COVID investigation, we look at FTIR based detection. Can we look at simplified methods to detect virus very quickly, and that's where FTIR instrument was quite helpful. Of course, for many of the things which we talk in the proteomics or genomics or a big data field, you need to prepare thousands and thousands of samples, right? And that's where having this kind of liquid handler becomes very handy, so that you can prepare samples in 96 well plate format, and you can prepare them quite in the robotic manner, and you don't have to rely on manual way of handling the pipettes. So again, some of these things can be helpful if you are looking at proteome-wide or genome-wide investigations. So in the clinical proteomics or clinical omics field, you are heavily relying on large number of clinical samples, right? And that's where the sample storage becomes quite challenging. I'm sure while discussing about COVID, you have heard about the storage issue of different vaccines, especially the RNA-based vaccines, which is Moderna and Pfizer they made, and storing them at minus 80 degrees, those kind of temperature can be very challenging. Now what I'm standing here is in front of one of the freezer which is having minus 86 degree temperature, and all of our clinical samples and different type of clones which are required for doing these kind of research are actually stored in that kind of condition. So you can imagine that to really prevent any kind of degradation of the samples and any contamination, we want to really store them to that level of freezing condition, right? And that's where doing this kind of research becomes quite challenging and resource intensive as well. And finally, let me show you that this is one of the big data processing server, where you can now take huge amount of data sets which we acquire from these instruments of mass spectrometers or NGS or PCR, and then we try to investigate that how to combine the data sets and look at it in a much more holistic manner. And that's where you need much more computing power. And of course, many of you who are from the engineering background and who are more intended for the data analysis part, I think you have to think about how to best utilize the computing power to process the big data in more meaningful manner.
All living organisms from various periods of evolution have been found to exhibit remarkable similarity at the biochemical level. Genetic information is stored in the form of DNA or RNA. The same set of 20 amino acids form the structural elements of proteins. Similar metabolic pathways and several proteins with structural similarity have been found to have similar roles in different organisms. All of these point towards the existence of a common ancestor from which various organisms evolved at different points of time. Several proteins have been identified that possess similar three-dimensional structures and perform very closely related functions in organisms that are separated in evolution over billions of years. One such protein is the Tata box binding protein, which plays an important role in gene regulation. Archaea are a group of prokaryotic organisms that are distinctly related to bacteria-like organisms. They are, however, more similar to eukaryotes than bacteria. Both archaea and eukaryotic genomes encode homologous histone proteins which are not present in bacteria. The ribosomal RNA and proteins, or archaea, closely resemble those of eukaryotes. However, archaea are capable of growing in extreme environmental conditions such as high temperatures, salt concentrations, etc. One of the most recent classifications of living organisms is a three-domain system consisting of bacteria, eukarya, and archaea. Although archaea were originally considered as bacteria, they were later classified into their own domain due to several differences in their metabolic pathways and genetics. Eukaryotes are believed to have evolved through several endosymbiotic relationships between various bacteria and archaea.
So let me continue where we stand. So we discussed about different properties of the cells, and we also tried to give you overview of how the bacterial cells, which are the prokaryotes, they're very simple, and one could see that the bacterial chromosome or the nucleic acid contents, they're free floating inside the bacteria. And now here, in addition to the bacterial chromosome, you also have the plasmid, which is extra chromosomal material. And and then there are a lot of ribosome which are floating in the cytoplasm. I think there was a couple of queries also on the cell wall compositions of these gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria, as well as the staining pattern. So I'm just refreshing these concepts. I'll come to the question answer shortly. So in the gram-positive bacteria, the cell wall is composed of a very thick layer of peptidoglycan, whereas in case of gram-negative bacteria, the cell wall composed of a very thin layer of peptidoglycan, and along with that, there is a outer membrane, which is composed of lipopolysaccharides. So if you look at the left side, gram-positive bacteria, it's more simpler in the composition because it has only two components, plasma membrane and cell wall, which is having a thick peptidoglycan layer. Whereas in case of gram-negative bacteria, it is having more complex architecture. Along with peptidoglycan, there is a outer membrane layer of the lipopolysaccharides as well. So the gram-positive bacteria, given that they have the thick layer of peptidoglycan, when you're doing the staining procedure, staining steps, and when you add the crystal violet stain, after that you're rinsing it off with ethanol in the washing step, and the crystal violet does not go off because the peptidoglycan is quite thick layer. It retains the stain. Therefore, you see the purple or the violet color in this gram-positive bacteria. In case of gram-negative bacteria, because the layer of peptidoglycan is quite thin, so when you are adding the stain, crystal violet, and then you're washing it off with ethanol, it actually goes off. And then now when you add another stain, which is the safranin stain, that gives the pink color, and that's why they look into the pink color bacteria. So this is just the broad scheme, but given that some of you had raised some queries, so I also put together this schematic of these steps involved in doing the this work. So here what you can see, like, you take the bacterial smear, which is bacteria from a test tube or from a plate, and put that in a microscopic glass slide. On top of that, then you add the grams crystal violet stain, do a couple of washing steps, add the grams iodine stain, add the decolorizer, which is the ethanol, and after washing those, then you can add the saffron dye, and then you can dry these slides, and you can look into how best you can visualize them to find the pattern shown on the right side, which is gram positive or gram negative. So I have also discussed that the eukaryotic cells, the animal cell or the plant cells, and especially they have quite a similar organelles which perform same functions, but there are few specialized organelles like vacuole and all, which is only specifically present in the plant cell and absent in the animal cell. We also talked about 3 domains of life, which is essentially the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes. Within the prokaryotes, we have bacteria as well as archaea. So let me now show you some hands-on bioinformatics. Given that you are doing a lot of hands-on on the screen, let me also do some hands-on on the screen and show you some skills of bioinformatics. So essentially, let's say we talk about different organism and different protein, and I mentioned to you that at the biochemical level, at the protein level, they're quite similar, right? So now when I take this particular hemoglobin protein, for example, and I want to try out to look at the protein sequences of hemoglobin from different organisms. So you can go to ncbi.nlm.nih.gov, and I think you should do that exercise rather than writing on the screen here. You can actually write on your own screen, go to NCBI and try to write this number, which is for a protein accession ID. And what you will get the protein sequence where you can click on the FASTA, and now you will get the amino acid sequence of a given protein. So proteins are made of these polypeptide chains composed of these amino acids. And so now we got the hemoglobin of Homo sapiens. Now we got hemoglobin of Bos taurus. And now you can take another protein, which is also for the hemoglobin, from different organism. Now it is from Mus musculus. And again, you are pasting the FASTA sequence. Why we are doing this exercise? We are doing this because we want to compare the hemoglobin protein from different organisms, how similar or dissimilar they are, right? And these comparisons are something which makes scientists and the various regulatory agencies know the lineage of these organism or these proteins. For instance, in the context of COVID-19, how people know that from where it originates, what kind of other recombination might be happening in SARS viruses which resulted into SARS-CoV-2. So there's a lot of evolutionary, interesting evolution which keep happening. And one could actually try to get the idea for those looking at the gene sequences or protein sequences. In this case, we are showing you some comparison of the protein sequences just for a given protein from different group of organism. So now we got hemoglobin protein from 5 different organisms. And our goal here is to try and compare these multiple sequences. So what we are looking at, just one protein and its multiple sequence alignments. So now you can go to another website, which is Clustal Omega. Now you want to do multiple sequence alignments and paste all these 5 FASTA sequence. So now you got these, so all these letters are essentially amino acids, which makes that protein in this particular organism. And now you want to compare how these same protein in different group of organism, how similar or dissimilar it is, right? So Clustal Omega, you can use the multiple sequence alignment MSA tool. And now what you see here, these are from these 5 organisms which we just compared. These are the amino acid sequences which are being compared. And I'm not going in great detail right now, but you can see there are some which are star, which is showing that these amino acids are conserved. These are actually common across all the group of these organisms. And then there are some which are not conserved, and there are a few where there is some substitution happening. So based on these information, then actually you can try to make these plots where you can say that, what is the similarity of these protein and what could be the lineage of these organisms based on this protein. And those you can look into the phylogenetic tree and the cladogram, which is shown here. And now you can see that, you have some idea that this hemoglobin protein is coming from different group of organism, right? Very nice drawing. I think you have made it right. The lineage can be shown creatively in this manner. So let's move on to the couple of these concepts which I'm talking to you is just to give you an idea that you can also try and do some of these things at your home and try to do some bioinformatics when you really, when you're tired of these annotations, then you can try out these things as well. So let me stop sharing and come to the Q&A session now. Maybe slightly out of the context as well, but I thought to still answer those. First one is that, if you have a sample which contains DNA, how exactly one could test for that, that this sample contains DNA, right? And that's where I think a lot of forensic testing and different type of testing happens. So for any kind of biomolecule to really work with, you have to first lyse the cell, right? So when we talk about prokaryotic cell or eukaryotic cell, you have to break open the cell membranes and try to get all the contents out, whether it's DNA or RNA or protein, everything, or even could be lipid or carbohydrate for that matter. You want to get everything out from the cell. And then you want to only enrich just one component, right? And that one component is DNA in this case, you want to enrich that. So for DNA precipitation, a simple way is that one could use chilled ethanol and then try to precipitate with that. And then you can also use the sodium acetate in that so that it can help you to precipitate DNA. You can wash it off. And the picture shows here in the test tube that before or after adding ethanol, how the DNA looks like, just like a small cotton ball with the threads, right? So that's something you can easily do that. How to test it out that what you have is the DNA. People look for the DNA absorption in the UV spectrophotometer, UV visible spectrophotometric analysis, where a ratio of 260 to 80 is being measured. And if you get around 1.8 ratio, that shows that you have good quality of pure DNA. That's not end. Please don't get afraid. We are not going to ask this question that what are all methods for you to do DNA detection. Since some of you have shown interest, I'm just giving you some more idea. There are many technologies where you can use that to assess the quality of these DNA. For instance, you can use the fluorometric analysis to look at the fluorescence of the DNA. You can also use the agarose gel electrophoresis to look at the DNA on the gel, something like this here. And you can find out the patterns of the band, which is stained in with the ethidium bromide. And you can look at that in the UV light. These are the interesting ways for you to know that what you got is the DNA, what is the concentration of that, what is the quality of that. Now, on top of that, if you want to amplify the DNA, then you can use a technique known as polymerase chain reaction or PCR. Now, PCR is one of the technique which you have recently heard. I'm sure some of you would have gone for active RT-PCR testing. What you have used for RT-PCR, that is not exactly the same what I'm talking here. The PCR, what we are looking at here is for amplification of DNA fragments. Whereas what you have gone through was looking at reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction with the more real-time PCR analysis. So over there, you want to look at the cycle of amplification of the nucleic acid. In this case, we just want to amplify the DNA using the PCR thermal cycler machine. So there are different type of technology like, PCR polymerase chain reaction. Then you have RT-PCR, which is known as reverse transcription PCR, or even RT-PCR known as real-time PCR. So there are different instruments. Again, I'm not going into too much detail so that you're not confused, but giving an idea that there are quite, easy and accurate methods to do the DNA precipitation, DNA extraction, knowing the concentration of that, amplify that, and use that for the analysis. So that's what being used for variety of testing, right? So in case of COVID, just so that, we talk in the context, when nasopharyngeal swab samples are being taken from the patients, RNA was extracted first. and then that from that mRNA, which is, you are enriching the viral mRNA, then the DNA, cDNA is being synthesized, which is being used for the real-time PCR analysis to detect is there sufficient amount of SARS-CoV-2 virus in a given patient sample. And if that is there, then person is declared as a COVID positive. Okay, another question was regarding the central dogma of life. Uh, Essentially, you want to have, the molecular biology works with the orderly information flow, which moves from the DNA to mRNA to the amino acids or proteins. And this entire process, which is starting from DNA to RNA, in the process of transcription or making from RNA to protein as a translation, all of these are essentially driving the functionality of the life, right? So starting from the static DNA or the genome, information is getting more functional at the RNA level and then getting translated to the protein, which is dynamic and functional molecule. This part from the RNA to DNA conversion can also happen, and that is known as reverse transcription, which is also quite important concept, and that's heavily used in this SARS-CoV-2 testing business. So central dogma of life is essentially giving you the flow of genetic information within a biological system. Now, just to make it more simplified, that how we foresee DNA, RNA, and proteins, and the central dogma of life, the information flow for that matter. Now, let's say you want to make a new building in IIT Bombay, and first near the Powai Lake area, you try to get a Google map that, okay, this is the location where we want to make the building. Then your architecture is going to give you some map, architect of that particular area, that how best you are going to make the building, how many rooms will be there, what all features will be there. And those are like a molecular photocopy. So from DNA, you are now converting to the functional information at the RNA level, but still you do not have a functional building. So for doing that, you need to put the mortars and bricks to make the building. And that's where the proteins comes into the play, which are the functional molecule. And these proteins are the one which are performing all the functions. So while each one of these are equally important molecules from DNA, RNA, and proteins, but one could only provide the location or the static blueprint. Second can give the functional architecture, and third can actually make the functional molecule or the visible function for that activity. Another query is that is plasmodesmata present in animal cells, right? So for cell-to-cell communication, you need some gaps, which is, we talked in the case of plants about the plasmodesmata, and those are essentially found only in plants, plasmodesmata, as well as in the algal cells, and absent in the animal cell. But animal cell have different ways of cell communication, which is known as the gap junctions. Again, Professor Rahul Purwar will talk this part in much more detail about the cell-cell communications, and you will have different ways of cell signaling and cell communication, which you will learn at that time. All right. Yeah, some queries were there regarding what are these archaea and how they are similar with eukaryotes. I just thought to give a little bit more idea for the archaea. So as we have discussed in the previous lecture, that archaea, these are prokaryotes, bacteria-like organism, but they have special abilities to withstand very extreme environments, right? So halophiles, like if you are traveling from plane, and if you look at sometime the field area, which is having a lot of salt patches, even in those areas, these kind of archaea can grow. Thermophiles, look at this kind of extreme heat environment. Even in that, one is able to grow and survive. That is these archaea. Methanogens, these gas plants for methane. Even in this environment, these archaea can grow. So these archaea, these are having some distinct feature which makes them unique than prokaryotes or eukaryotes. And some of these properties are lying based on their cell membrane architecture, especially if you look at their cell membrane composition. They have few chemicals which are different than the prokaryotes or eukaryotes for that matter. They contain few fatty acids which are quite branched molecule like isoprenes, and that gives them some special abilities. But coming to your question again directly, which I have already talked in the class, archaea and how similar they are with the eukaryotes. Let me, before I again take this question, let me first describe a new concept here. In eukaryotes, you have histone proteins, and these are the 8 histone proteins which are attached to the DNA molecules. And then they form a complex known as nucleosome. So these histone proteins are quite unique in the eukaryotes. They are absent in the prokaryotes. I will again talk these things in more detail in the subsequent lectures when I am talking that context. But since you've asked the questions, I'm showing it in this place here. So histone proteins, these are quite unique in the eukaryotes. And when we have these fiber of the packed nucleosomes, that is known as the chromatin. So now coming back to the comparison of archaea and eukaryotes, they look quite similar, but they have some specific features which are closer to the eukaryotes as compared to the bacteria. So archaea and eukaryote, their genome, they have the histone proteins, which is associated with DNA, and that makes them closer to the eukaryotes, while this protein histone is missing in the bacteria. So now they are more closer to the eukaryotes as compared to the bacteria. Also, some of the RNA and the protein compositions of the archaea is more similar to the eukaryotes than bacteria. So again, some of these things make them closer to eukaryotes as compared to the prokaryotes. So I hope now you are clear about this point. Another question was that do animal cells have a vacuole at all? Of course, I think in the discussions we talked about the plant cell and animal cell. So animal cell have very rudimentary or very tiny vacuole, whereas the plant cell have very enlarged and the functional very huge vacuoles. Just to make it more crude but clear, and these vacuoles, these are the large vesicles which are derived from the endoplasmic reticulum or the Golgi apparatus. In the animal cells, these vacuoles are going to sequester the waste products. In plants, you generate a lot more waste products from the different pigments and toxins. Therefore, you need much larger vacuole to perform these functions. Even some of the food vacuoles, like shown here on the right side, which is formed, that is because of these process known as phagocytosis, which means it is forming the smaller vacuoles, which could help in the digestion of the food. So again, there are a lot of function for these activity, but just to keep it simple, yes, animal cells do have a vacuole, but much rudimentary as compared to the plant, which has a more functional and much enlarged vacuole. I think one of the students has asked for the clarification on the terms genes, chromosomes, and DNA. I think this image was probably clear to explain that. In the human body, you have billions of cells, and these cells contain this nucleus. Now, each nucleus that contains all these chromosomes. Now, these chromosomes, they contain these genes, which is having DNA. Now, just to enlarge this part more, this is the chromosome. Again, I will talk this in more when I talk about in the cell cycle part. This is detailed structure of a chromosome, and you have the sister chromatids, which are attached on a centromere, and that place is known as, some proteins are there, which is known as kinetochore. Look at more enlarged view of it from the chromosomes and genes now, the DNA part. You have these exons and introns, and during the process of alternative splicing, these introns come out and exons come together, and they form the functional RNA molecule. So genes are essentially the basic units of heredity and the sequence of nucleotides in DNA or RNA that encodes the synthesis of the gene products, whether RNA or the proteins. I think one more insightful question was that it is said that mitochondria has evolved from bacteria, then it must do all function which a nucleus can. So can the cell survive without nucleus, right? I think a very thoughtful question. And I think I'm definitely going to talk this part about these two unique organelles which we talked, mitochondria and chloroplast, which are double membranous and having their own DNA. And they show a lot of autonomy in the cell. No other organelle other than nucleus has the DNA or the double membrane structure. So these are quite similar to that. And I'm going to talk about some evolutionary context of how these different type of bacteria probably came in touch with the eukaryotic cell and got engulfed. And as a result, some aerobic bacteria from mitochondria and some of the non-photosynthetic, these were non-photosynthetic one, and some were photosynthetic bacteria, they also came in touch with the eukaryotic cell and gave rise to the chloroplast. So again, there are some evolutionary theory to that, endosymbiotic theory, which I will talk in the next class to make it more clear. Nevertheless, for your query, a nucleus is of course the most important part here. The animal cell has a defined nuclear membrane. It is very crucial. Eukaryotic cell cannot perform without this. The RBC, red blood cells, they do not have any nucleus, and therefore when they, after they become mature, they get degenerated, right? When we had talked about the bacteria, we have discussed about nucleoid, which is a free-floating bacterial chromosome. And now if you look at the mitochondrial structure and the mitochondrial DNA, that actually form the pattern like nucleoid, right? So that shows quite similarity like bacteria. So can cells survive without nucleus? In case of prokaryotes, of course, they don't have defined nucleus. So yes, in case of eukaryotes, if it is because we have defined nucleus, it cannot survive without that. But mitochondria and chloroplast have their ability to survive on their own. And because of their own genome components, they can also synthesize some of the protein themselves. And to get more of the insightful discussion, you can refer to this particular article, which I have pasted the link for here. I think there were some related queries on the same topic, that it's not clear if the organelles, mitochondria and chloroplast are bacteria or not. So again, it is a wild theory that they were bacteria, billions of years ago, who came in touch with these eukaryotic cells and then slowly became part of this particular eukaryotic cell. And as a process of endosymbiosis, now they persist in the eukaryotic cell. So whether they are still bacteria, you can't say that, because they don't make those toxin genes. Now they're part of the eukaryotic cell, but their origin could be from bacteria. And that's where these important evolutionary concepts comes into the play, which will be part of the next lecture. What is the basic need in these cells to keep developing and make it better? Of course, this is very much linked to the cell cycle and development, which is going to be part of the next lecture. So one more question is quite a descriptive question. How do we come to know that Golgi apparatus transports protein, endoplasmic reticulum process and transport proteins? Nucleus contain genetic information of the cell, because we cannot actually see these organelles working and observe their functions. Then how we come to know about these organelles, how do they work, right? And I think that's a very curious and nice question. Of course, without doing experiments, you should not believe that how these things work. And that's where when we do this course, we also try to give at least some experimental feel by showing some demonstrations in the class itself. Now, just to keep it clear here, there are different ways of assessing. As I mentioned in the beginning, that when you look in biomolecules, you break open the cell and you want to get out from the cell the DNA separately, RNA separately, protein separately, lipid separately, carbohydrate separately, and you want to then do different type of testing from those, right? Likewise, if you're interested to look into different organelle, you are only looking at nucleus, or you're looking at endoplasmic reticulum or mitochondria, you have to do some experiment to first enrich these organelle. And a good way of doing that is the differential centrifugation way, to really centrifuge the cells at different gravity force. And now there has already been standardized that at what gravity force, what kind of organelle can get more enriched. And that's where you can see in this particular picture that at different RPM, different type of organelles are getting enriched. Now, let's say you at specific RPM like 20,000 G, you got this pellet which is rich in the mitochondria. And now you want to test out whether this pellet, what I think is mitochondria, is really mitochondria. So now you take out that, you suspend that in buffer, and you want to now test some of the enzymatic activity for the enzymes which are linked to mitochondria, because there are several ATPase and different type of machinery which provides mitochondria the ability to perform all the cellular respiration activities. So now you can test for those enzymes, and in this particular fraction, which you will not find when you look at the nuclear fraction, and those enzymes will not be present there. So again, you can enrich these things. There is, of course, looking at microscopic based investigations. You can always look at these cells and these organelles under the microscope. And there are different dyes which you can try to localize these as well and look into that where you have the nucleus, where you have mitochondria likewise. Yeah. So the different experimental way to look into the cytology and a biochemical way of ascertaining that what you're working on is the right organelle. There are a couple of questions regarding gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria and the Gram staining. The Gram staining, as I mentioned, is a staining procedure based on name of a scientist. And we have already discussed about gram-positive and gram-negative staining. Essentially, you should keep in mind a couple of points that the gram-positive has simple cell wall, whereas the gram-negative has more complex cell wall because it contains the lipopolysaccharides along with a thin layer of peptidoglycan. Whereas here you have a thick peptidoglycan layer, but no polysaccharides. Gram-positive retains violet stain color and gives you the blue coloration, whereas the gram-negative retains saffron color and gives you the red coloration. All right, one more question was about the waterproofing of the lotus, which we spoke. We try to give you some examples of biomimicry and bio-inspired engineering, that how well people have made observations from the nature and try to use those to come up with the new devices or new products. And in this case, in the lotus, the water droplets cannot stay and they roll down. And same phenomenon was being utilized by Evologics and a paint company, which they tried to come up with new ways of making the buildings, which is the stain repellent and the water repellent. So in this case, they observed that the lotus leaf, they have these small gaps, which is the crevices, which can trap the air, and that is going to ensure that the waxy coating of the leaf and these air which is trapped makes them very hydrophobic. And these hydrophobic characteristics, they are actually because of the contact angle which is forming between these droplet surface and the fabric surface, that makes them more hydrophobic substance. And with this, the higher contact angle is made, that makes the water droplets more spherical and water rolls down from the leaf. So, the hydrophobic characteristic, the way it has been achieved, similar phenomenon being observed and utilized in the products like paints. One more question was about what is the function of centrosome and why is it not needed in the plants? Also, the cell division of the plant cell. So centrosome is essentially going to be involved in the cell division process. Fungi and the plants, they actually lack the centrosome. This question will be, I think, better addressed when I will speak to you in the next class about cell cycle and cell division, where we'll talk about animal and the plant cells. But just to keep this, very, brief, in the fungus and plant, there is the lacking of the centrosomes, and they have different mechanisms which they have evolved, how best they can still utilize and they can overcome this gap. And for that, they have some protein like gamma tubulins, which can nucleate some of the microtubule proteins, and those could help something like what animal cells do with the centrioles. So we will talk more about the cell division of animal and plants and role of centrosome in the next class. One more question was the flagellum in the eukaryotic cells. There are different locomotor appendages where you see the role of cilia or flagella, especially the animal sperms or the algae like Cladomonas. These kind of flagella are seen in different cells, but they are quite different. In the case of prokaryotes, they are in the unicellular organisms, they are makes them very motile. In eukaryotes, you have multiple functions to play, but they are not always involved in the motility part. The prokaryotic flagella is also quite large in the size as compared to the eukaryotic flagella. Again, if you want to know more about the differences of prokaryotic and eukaryotic flagella, you can refer this table. I'm not going to read and give you too much detail about it because it's beyond what I'm going to ask the questions in the course. But in case some of you are really keen on knowing about the details, I think these table reference can be utilized for understanding it better. How does prokaryotic bacteria use their flagella to move? Especially you want to know more about what tells them where the food is, what tells them how to move to get the food, how does this motion work? So I think some of these are really interesting observations and interesting questions for the very first lecture to start with. And that shows your curiosity, which is pretty nice. Prokaryotes, being the unicellular, they have to perform everything from that cell, and that cell has to recognize many things from, unlike the eukaryotic cells, and when we start discussing about more of the evolved organisms. So here, they are going to rely a lot about the stimulus, how they can sense a given type of chemical. And based on that, they can either be attracted towards that or they can be away from that. So the right side image shows you the chemoattractant, means some chemical where, these microbes or these prokaryotes can be attracted. And chemorepellent, which means it is moving away from that chemical, could be more toxic substance there. So these prokaryotes, they are able to perform the taxis or a very directed movement towards or away from a stimulus. And that really helps them to perform their various function, including, their ability to sense for the food with the certain chemicals and look for more, the chemoattractant behavior for doing that activity. One more question was about nucleus and nucleoid. I think I did show when I was drawing on the board a structure for the small nucleoid, which is lying within the nucleus. Nucleoid is found in the prokaryotes primarily and store their genetic materials. Nucleus is found primarily in the eukaryotes and store their genetic materials. It is known as the largest and the well-organized cell. It is known as the small and the well-organized cell as well. Nucleoids contain only one set of chromosomes. It is irregular shaped, does not contain any membrane. Nucleolus is another organelle which is absent in the nucleoid. And nucleoplasm is the material which is lying, surrounding to that, which is absent in the nucleoid. So I'm not going to ask again this kind of detailed, analogy and the comparison of nucleus or nucleoid, but there is a difference between these, and these are much more detailed explanation of if you really want to understand about how nucleoid is different. Nucleoid is just a small part of the nucleus and not found in all the cells. Few general questions were like, how to suggest us to take the notes, taking down running notes during the recorded lecture, or copying down important points from the handouts after watching the lecture. Well, that will be individuals' perception and ability, how well you want to understand a lecture. But I personally feel that while you're watching a lecture, a lot of discussion and commentary goes on along with that, which can be taken as a notes. And of course, then you have handouts where you can pen down some of these important points as well. What is the grading scheme? I mean, how many AAs are handed out and what is the rough cutoffs? All those modern drawings, people will not get AAs. That's clear. Those who want to get AAs have to be more sincere. We do give a lot of AAs and even APs to people who are serious and who do well. But you have to keep up the pace from the first lecture itself. And therefore, your class presence, your class performance, your class participation actively, not in the negative way, and your continuous quiz performance are going to make you very competitive. And this is kind of course where people actually at the end come scribbling that, okay, with the 0.5 marks, my grade has become AB and I can't get AA. And at that time, we can't help, because if your attendance is low, your quiz was, performance was very bad, we can't change those things. So it is a good idea for you to get serious from the beginning. Well, welcome to IIT Bombay, and you are towards the, competing with the best of the students, right? You're all selected from the toughest exams of India, but now you have to also compete among your peers and you have to perform the best within those. The grading is going to be competitive grading with the class performance, right? So from the beginning itself, my advice to all of you is, please leave this childish behavior, start getting more mature from the beginning itself. Make sure that you are really jumping at it and you are taking the lead. First 2-3 lectures usually decide the whole grade of the class, okay? Because some people really take the lead and some people are really behind, and you can't catch up because things will really move very rapid pace. Tomorrow you will have the tutorial, then next day you will have another class from my side, and the first quiz will start for the grading. So things will move very fast. Good idea to watch the lecture, take the notes, clarify the doubts, whatever is possible, despite all the issues of pandemic and lockdown and being not available physically. But still, I'm sure we are giving you enough time, in fact more time than what we used to give in the classroom teaching. I'm doing almost double the work, recording the lecture beforehand for you to watch that, and then again spending my same time to interact with you, and also going to take your query in any forward to address those questions, which we don't take so much time for any routine physical class. But again, given the situation, we are very considerate for all this stuff. But please make sure you are also professional and considerate that the instructors are spending their quality time with you, so you should be giving your quality output for that. All right. So that's all for this particular activity of Q&A from the forum which we had. I will now give you another idea. I see a lot of hands, but please don't worry. I will be with you. I'll not let you go without addressing your query. So let me now share another instruction for all of you, which will be now the fun activity to start to see the quiz part. So just give me 1 minute to get the Kahoot detail. All right, so I'm going to give you some instructions that how are you going to play the quiz. Today's quiz is not going to be used for any evaluation. It is just for you to get practice and to know that later on what is the ways we are going to expect you to write the quizzes. I'm going to give you the instructions for this quiz. Please get ready to play Kahoot now.
Thank you, Professor Sanjeeva. Hi all, my name is Shalini and I am one of the TAs of PB101. So I would like to welcome you all to the course. So for this, I'll be giving you a few instructions for Kahoot, which we are going to play now. So you'll be requiring 2 screens for playing Kahoot. One, where you're watching these instructions right now, will have all the questions displayed on the screen. Whereas you'll be needing another screen, which can be your mobile screen. And for that, you'll be able to see all the options which you can select to answer the questions displayed on the screen. So for the options, you'll have to go on kahoot.it. Once you go on kahoot.it, you'll be able to see this screen where it will ask you a game pin. So on the screen where I'm giving you instructions right now, you'll be able to see a game pin once we start the game. After adding the game pin in your mobile, you'll be redirected to another screen which will ask you for your nickname. In nickname, please enter your enrollment IDs only or enrollment numbers only. No nickname other than that will be accepted. And just remember that all the questions which you are going to answer from now in the Kahoot part will not be on the basis of accuracy only, but also on the basis of speed. So people who are giving correct answers will be ranked differently on the basis of how fast they are answering the questions. So let's go to Kahoot and enjoy. Thank you.
All right, so everyone please go to kahoot.it website. Please make sure while writing your name, you should put the roll number very clearly. Now your roll numbers are going to be used for attendance as well. The Kahoot output we are going to use as attendance. So if you write any other nickname, you will be considered as absent from the class, right? So later on, we can't make any change.
So the quiz ends. So here's the results.
All right, well, congratulations to all the winners for playing so well. And I hope all of you enjoyed playing Kahoot game. So with this, we are ending this session.